Welcome to MacroHive Conversations with Bilal Hafiz. MacroHive helps educate investors and provide investment insights for all markets from crypto to equities to bonds. For our latest views, visit macrohive.com.
So greetings and welcome, Max. It's fantastic to have you on the podcast show.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Now, there's a lot going on, but before we do that, I do like to ask my guests something about their origin story. So it'd be fantastic to hear from your own words what you studied at university. Was it inevitable you'd end up in public service, and then some of the key career milestones up until now?
Fantastic. And inevitable, maybe if you look backwards, but it certainly didn't feel inevitable, going forward. But I grew up in Iowa, went to junior high and high school there, and it's relevant because the sort of proximity to politics and government. And so it was part of the ethos that government was and politics was part of your life. And you asked me what I studied. I, first of all, graduated early from high school, went to France and was an exchange student there for a year, did their baccalaureate, and went to Yale University where I studied humanities, which was and still is a interdisciplinary program. They took 16 students, and it was the first year of the program when I was there. And it was wonderful because it was professors from different disciplines who joint taught, and we studied according to time periods, not according to individual disciplines. So you would have the history and the literature and the art, the philosophy all together. And as with all things university related, it was my fellow students who made the program so wonderful. But it was also an environment where I could actually engage in politics, and started a political study group and invited presidential candidates there. And, so that thematic has been there for my entire life, caring about our government institutions and the processes that set them up and the leaders that are running them.
And you've set up the Partnership for Public Service, which you've been running for some time now. And can you talk a bit more about what it does and how it's different from other kind of public think tanks?
Yep, absolutely. And I should add that I worked in government. I went to law school. My first job after law school was first clerking for a judge in Vermont, and then working at the Justice Department, and then clerking for David Souter on the Supreme Court, and then to the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And I'm finally at the answer to the question that you actually asked me. I was leaving government, had no idea what I wanted to do, talked to something like 60 people in 3 weeks. And in my journey, I just made a list of all the people who I thought were the most interesting people. And they then sent me on to others, and I got 5 or 6 removed. This is all pre, social media, social network, opportunities. And I met a gentleman named Sam Heyman, who had been concerned about the fact that people coming out of university were not as interested in going into government as they had been when he had graduated from law school some 40 years earlier. And, basically he decided to stake me on starting a nonprofit organization, which became the Partnership for Public Service, and is now a nonpartisan nonprofit organization focused on better government and stronger democracy. And what that really means functionally is we work to make our government better. And our theory of the case is that we have one tool for collective action as a society that has the imprimatur of the public and taxpayer resources behind it. Everybody loves to propose policies. Very few people pay any attention to the execution of those policies or the institutional capacity to make those policies real. And that's the point of focus that we have. So up until relatively recently, it was very lonely. There were no other organizations. We're thinking about really the health of our public institutions, or certainly not doing so from the nonprofit side. And it is vital, and we're seeing that today in a very big way.
Okay, no, that's great. So it's less about some of these think tanks that make big proposals on what the budget should look like and things like that. It's more about the effectiveness of policy and just how to get things done in a way that sort of meets the goals of government.
You said it, better than I did. Absolutely.
Great. Now, of course, Trump has the new administration has come into office, and it's been really quite chaotic in some ways and very dramatic. But before we go into sort of the latest round of what Trump has been doing in this second administration, can we go back to Trump 1.0? And, how would you characterize Trump's relationship with the operations of government and what he did in Trump 1.0 first, before we go into Trump 2.0?
Yeah, I mean, there certainly were the seeds of what we're experiencing today, but you're correct that they're very different scenes in the drama that we're involved in right now. In Trump 1.0, you first, I think, had a president who really had no preparation for being president, no clarity that then President Trump thought that he might actually win. We were very involved amongst the activities that we do at the partnership. We run the Center for Presidential Transition, and we started that some 16 years ago, realizing that the handoff of power was one of those critical processes that you noted earlier are really important for the execution of government, but no one paid any attention to them. Again, it was all about winning the election, or it was about the policy choices that the new president might want to pursue, but nothing about like, how do you actually take over the government effectively and implement those policies, and what do you need to do that, and then what does that look like, and then what does the system, the rules actually need to look like to make that successful. So we were very, very heavily involved with Trump's transition operation in 2016. Governor Chris Christie was his head of the transition, and there was a gentleman by the name of Rich Bagger who was the executive director. And we really helped them set up that transition operation. And what you saw was a very effective operation that, frankly, then candidate Trump paid no attention to. Election happens, he wins. 2 days later, he fires Chris Christie. He ran a small business, a family business in the private sector, and he treated the federal government the same way. So he had no real appreciation for government process, for the larger footprint that the government had, that it didn't come from him, it was not real or important. I think what he learned from his first term, however, was that he couldn't actually get everything done that he wanted to do, because there were other people, mainly people that he had appointed, and certainly also civil servants, who were looking out for the rule of law, the Constitution, and were calling out problems with some of the things that he was proposing, and ultimately stopping him. And I think what we are seeing in round two is the lesson that he learned from that, which was, if he wants what he wants to, and he's going to get what he wants, he needs to make sure that there aren't anybody or any institutional restraints on his getting it. And so that has meant that, unlike the first term where he appointed a fair range of different people, but primarily people who nonetheless were respectful of institutional norms and of the rule of law, that is not what we're seeing today. Instead, we're seeing a president that has, prioritized, loyalty to him over and above everything else, and who is upending the career civil service and other institutional guardrails that might otherwise prevent him from getting everything that he wants in exactly the way he wants it.
How previous transitions occurred, between when there's party switch. So, for example, say Bush Jr. handing over to Obama, or Clinton handing over to Bush Jr. How does it typically occur, even with like opposing parties as they sort of transition?
Yeah. What's interesting is, prior to the transitions involving Trump, the transition that has been noted as the most difficult was the one from Reagan to Bush. So it's actually not typically the party difference that is most relevant. There's an awful lot to say about the transition field, but to try to be succinct about it, there's sort of pre 9/11 and post 9/11 in terms of transition. So, post 9/11, George Bush learned a very important lesson. He had a truncated transition process because of the conflict over the 2000 election. And 9/11 was, a real formative experience for him as being president. And he committed in a deep way to making sure that his administration did everything they could to enable the incoming Obama administration to succeed. So he directed his, White House Chief of Staff, Josh Bolten, to make it a priority, and they really did. And they set the gold standard on how an incumbent president should behave in terms of handing off power to a successor. Structure that we were involved in building, but John Podesta and Chris Liu, were very who led the transition were very good at what they were doing. That worked well. I think it's what happened afterwards that you saw challenges. The Obama administration wanted to pay it forward. They did, again, everything that they could to ensure that the Trump team would have available to it all of the resources they needed. And the Trump team didn't really take advantage of it. As I noted, they were not respectful of the preparation work at all. And they were disorganized and actually very slow in getting their people in place and getting things done as a result of it. And then we obviously had, the very significant challenges of the handoff from Trump to Biden, where there was active effort to make it difficult. But the Biden team had done, I think, a phenomenal job. Worth noting that was the first ever virtual transition preparation because they were unable, given the circumstances of COVID, to actually do this stuff in person. And then you have the latest transition operation, which again, I think the Biden team did all that they could to help an incoming Trump team that didn't want to play ball in any way and was unwilling to enter into the basic agreements with government agencies that are really pretty fundamental to ensuring transitions can be successful. And ultimately entered into those agreements late in the day with not a lot of energy or willingness to engage. And I think it's had consequences, and it's also indicative of the broadly speaking, the contempt they have for the government institutions, for government employees, and for the safeguards around classified documents and security that are pretty important in today's world.
And now let's move on to the current administration.
Yeah.
I mean, to take their perspective, at least what can sort of disentangle their perspective. One critique they have of government is that it's too bloated, it's inefficient, it's expensive, budget deficit's huge, there's a lot of waste, corruption, and so on. So that's one sort of line of attack that they, or one criticism they have that they want to deal with. Another part of it is the whole idea of a deep state, that there's this administrative state that's unelected and it exercises a huge amount of power outside of the spotlight, and they stop people who are elected, like the executive, from doing their job. So that needs to be dealt with. So, I mean, what do you think of those two things?
Yeah.
One is around costs and waste,
Yeah.
and the others around accountability.
Yeah. So as a starting proposition, it's 100% correct that we need consequential reform. And how could it be any other way? I mean, we have a world that is, spinning very, very fast and changing in very real ways. Risks are appearing that were not on the scene before. They're moving very fast. So again, coming back to the proposition that our government should be about solving big problems. When the problem set changes, your government needs to change. And we've had a disinvestment in our government. So our government has not kept up with the world around it. So that is a valid concern. The question is, how do you address it? And you don't address it by blowing it up. Like, that is not actually, it puts a lie to that as being the motivation for this. Like, you don't burn the city in order to save the city. And that is what we're seeing right now, like arson across the board, without really any improvement. We're going to actually see going backwards in so many different ways. So, and very importantly on this cost question about like waste, the way things are being done, what everyone thinks about the policy directions, the way they are being done are phenomenally wasteful. And it's just, I think, impossible to argue with. You don't walk in and in effect randomly fire people without any attempt to discern whether you can go after poor performers or whether there are occupation groups that are overly represented in the government. None of that has occurred. It is frankly a random process. Right now we're seeing hundreds of thousands of federal employees, vulnerable employees that are on the chopping block because simply they're probationary, meaning they've been in government largely for under a year, and so they're easier to fire. Easier to fire doesn't mean they're the right people to fire. So like, there's no argument here that you're actually saving money. And the way it's being done too is creating enormous liabilities for the American taxpayer through our federal government because they're being fired illegally. So this is, clearly not an effort to save money. That is not actually what is going on. Now, you raised the second proposition, which is the deep state. And is this, in fact, a way to bring to heel, a set of federal workers who are insufficiently responsive to the duly elected leader? And the answer there is they're actually creating the deep state. Just in the first instance, this is creating waste and additional cost. Their actions are, in effect, an effort to create a deep state. And when I say that, it is worth taking a quick detour into history. And we, in the 19th century, we had a series of presidents. Really, Jackson was the primary exhibitor of this, who followed something called the spoils system. And the idea really was, to the victor goes the spoils. The election winner, the president of the United States, was able to staff the federal government, which was a tiny, tiny entity relative to what it is today, and frankly, dealing with a lot less complex issues. They were able to staff it with people who were partisans, who were loyalists, who could even fund, future campaigns by the president and that party. And the end result of this was corruption. The end result of it was incompetence in government. And the end result in the United States was the assassination of President Garfield in 1881 by a disgruntled job seeker. And that led to a big change in the way we ran our government. Instead of the spoils system, we moved to a nonpartisan, apolitical, and merit-based civil service, although we still have elements of that spoils system to this day, which we can talk about if you want. But for 140 years, Republican and Democratic presidents and leaders alike have all understood that the way you get better out of our government is by having, again, a set of experts in the civil service who are not selected on the basis of their party affiliation, but because they're the right people, the most expert to do the job. We're seeing today an explicit effort by the current administration to return us to that spoils system. So the argument that this is a way of getting rid of the deep state is upside down, because they are quite explicitly moving us to a spoils system on the grounds that this enables the president to do the things that they want to do, irrespective, honestly, of the rule of law or of our constitutional system. And there should be no mistake about this. When you fire federal prosecutors who have done nothing more than their job to be prosecutors without fear or favor, because they have pursued cases that you as an individual have a private interest in, that's a big problem. When you fire FBI agents that go after lawbreakers who were involved in January 6th, that's a huge problem. And you're seeing this across the board, a government that is being brought to heel to a personal agenda rather than the public good.
I mean, one observation some people make, at least, is that the types of people that work in the federal government tend to be left-leaning, tend to be for Democrats. Obviously, almost by default, that's likely to occur. Because Democrats or left-leaning people typically believe in government more than, say, Republicans are. So is there an argument to make there is some kind of bias? Perhaps the way Trump and the administration is going about it is incorrect. But is there something to be said about either bias or just the inherent nature of bureaucracy, that it kind of feeds on itself and ends up becoming this big sort of lumbering organization?
So two different issues that are I think intertwined in what you had to say, and they come back to the points you made earlier. There's no question we need to reform our government. It needs to be modernized, and it can do better. It should be more customer focused. It should have better technology. There should be more accountability to make sure that people who are poor performers, and we understand what poor performance actually is, are held to account. They're either fired or disciplined if they're not getting the jobs done that they need to do. So the question is how you get there. And what we're seeing right now is actually, again, taking us in the exact wrong direction. And there are laws that could be changed. A good example of this is the way federal employees are paid today is based on a 1949 law. No federal employee chose that to be the mechanism by which they're being paid. It's leaders that have failed to take on these challenges. But the Trump administration is not taking this on. Instead, they're randomly firing people and creating huge liabilities for the American taxpayer, as well as putting huge risk on all of us, because the things that these federal workers are supposed to do are not going to get done well or done at all. So it's not the case that this is in fact about this issue of government working better. Now, you raised this question about, well, it's just a bunch of lefties who are in the government. Interestingly, these are stats that most people don't know. A third of do we think that of the military? Let me start there. And I would say no. I don't think most people think that the military is biased in terms of being progressive or not. A third of the federal workforce are veterans, and the reason why they're veterans is because they're people who are deeply committed to service to their nation. They've done it in uniform, and their second act is by doing it in the civil service. If you look at the organizations that are being traumatized right now, the people who are in those organizations, like the FBI or the intelligence community, I'd be astonished, and I don't have any data specifically on this, that you would see a preponderance of lefties in either organization. That dog doesn't hunt. Like, it is just not correct. The real question is, do you have an ethos in our government that no matter what your politics, you understand that your responsibility is to take the direction of the political leaders because they represent the will of the people to the extent it is consistent with the law and the Constitution? And the answer is that in our government. And what we're seeing now is an effort to blow that up. So it no longer is the ethos. So instead, it's follow the leader no matter what, whether it's against the law or against the Constitution. And none of us should want that. And in fact, we have polling that shows that the vast majority of Republicans, Democrats, and independents indeed do want an apolitical, merit-based civil service. We are in the throes of watching what we have blown up, despite the fact that it's taking us in the exact wrong direction of where we need to go. It's a little bit, again, like the house that you're in, and you find a spot in the curtains, and so the answer is, let's just burn the whole place down. That's not what you do. You clean the spot. You don't set fire to the whole place, and that is what we're observing right now.
And, from my understanding, previous administrations have tried to reform government. Clinton did, Bush did, and Obama did.
Not enough.
How these, or even Reagan, perhaps? I mean, what's the history here in terms of attempted reforms and
so the history is not good. I mean, the history, again, is like, the way I think about it, and this may be, too wonky, is that you've had short-term leaders that don't focus on the long-term needs of the institutions that they run. And what I mean by that is, I don't think, Republican or Democrat, that folks have really minded the store. Again, they have been incentivized to announce the policy, but not to ensure that it's executed effectively, or that the institution itself, the people, the culture, the technology, that those things are actually being invested in the way they need to be. The tendency is for political leaders to burn through what they have rather than to create more capacity for the future. And that is why we're in the hole we're in, is that you have had that short-termism in Republican and Democratic administrations. Very, very few presidents have really prioritized institutional health. You do really need to go back to the reinventing government effort by Clinton, where you had the vice president who was tagged with doing this work. But that was a long time ago. Like, you're now talking, multiple decades in the past. And again, this has to be a constant effort. It's not one and done. Like, the world changes, our government needs to keep up. And it's not keeping up because leaders are not prioritizing it. Inside and frankly, outside government, we haven't talked about Congress. They're a huge part of the problem here. They haven't passed the appropriations for government agencies on time, all of them, since like 1996. So again, people ask, well, why can't we run it like a business? It's because it's much, much more complicated and hard. Could you run a business when you don't even know what your budget is? That your committed money might be for several weeks, and you just have huge uncertainty with the continuing resolutions where you can't start programs or start new ones. I mean, no organization is going to run real well with the poor oversight and engagement that we've had from Congress on the executive branch.
And you mentioned sort of Congress. I mean, in terms of reforming government, who needs to lead this? Does it come from the executive? Does it come from Congress? Or
It should be all the above. And
okay,
it should be the private sector too. I mean, the reality is that the same issue of leaders focusing on the policies that they want and not thinking about how do you execute it effectively happens from the private sector. So you have lots of industries lobbying to get the rule they want, the direction they want, but they're really not focused on again, the organizational capacity to do that well. And therefore they don't get it. So it's very interesting. Like in business, the expectation is the idea is the easy part. It's the execution that takes up most of the energy of organizations and certainly leaders. And when they deal with government, private sector leaders don't do that. They focus on that idea rather than the execution capability. And this sounds maybe like inside baseball or abstract in ways, but it has real consequence. And one of those consequences is our government writ large has not, in fact, kept up with the world around it. And we are not getting the services that the public really wants at the level that they want. And that dissatisfaction contributes to the lack of trust and contributes to, some of the, support for, actions that I think are actually detrimental to the public.
and you mentioned appropriations and this reliance on continuing resolutions. We also hear that the military hasn't been audited for a number of years, and something like that sounds very strange. Because the military is a huge line item in the overall budget. I mean, how can something like that not happen?
Well, again, I mean, it is quite remarkable, but the answer to that is it's back to this issue of who's minding the store, and are the leaders who are there prioritizing making those investments? And the answer is they're not. I mentioned earlier that there's still vestiges of the spoil system. When I said that, there are, about 2 million civil servants. Know that is approximately the same size as it was in 1969. So again, this whole issue of the headcount being, growing topsy-turvy is ridiculous. That's in absolute terms. In relative terms, the size of the federal workforce has shrunk dramatically because our country has grown so much. So it's not about the headcount. We shouldn't mistake the number of federal employees as to the size of government. Amongst the 2+ million federal civil servants, there are 4,000 political appointees. So that number is like many multiples in excess of any of our peer democracies. If you think about, countries like Great Britain or France or Japan or whatever, democracy you want to name, they count their political appointees in tens, not thousands. And the reason why this is relevant is that by having so many political appointees, you do reinforce that short-termism and the willingness of the political leaders to believe they can run the institution with the people they bring rather than engaging the workforce that is already there. And this is, again, one of the reasons why what's happening today is so troubling, because what the new administration is driving towards is taking that 4,000 political appointments and effectively, multiplying that by 10 or 100 or 1,000. Super unclear exactly like how much, but by a lot. And what we will get again is corruption, incompetence, and a much, much worse government that puts us all at risk because the most fundamental task of our government is to keep us safe.
And something like healthcare, in the US, if you compare US healthcare expenditure compared to any other developed country,
Yes.
democracy or otherwise, it's incredibly high.
Yes.
Something like that. I mean, what's the cause of that? I mean, is it that there's this kind of weird private public sector kind of combination, and pharmaceutical companies are left unfettered, or how does that relate to what we've been talking about?
So you presented me with a pretty big issue about like what's going on for our government. Now you're expanding the field of conversation to another big issue, healthcare. Obviously your numbers are correct, but the one thing that I didn't hear from you is not only do we spend a lot larger percentage of our GDP on healthcare costs, despite the fact that the denominator is already very large in terms of who we are, but we get worse outcomes. It's substantially worse outcomes on very important things like infant mortality and, even, like longevity. Pretty fundamental things. And it is a complicated topic that I am not broadly expert on, but there's no question that some of the things that we're talking about here are quite relevant to that, because what you really want is a government, number one, that is providing strong data and analysis so that you have leaders that can make good, policy choices. I think what you see in the United States is a system in which there are a lot of interest groups that have that are very committed and dug into the status quo, and the status quo is not a good place for us to be. And I do think we haven't talked about this, more broadly speaking on the government side. If there are two things that I am hopeful for, despite all the destruction that we're seeing, number one would be a public that actually understands, engages, and cares about the nature of their government in a way that really hasn't been true since the last spoils system we had, 140 years ago. And the second, which would come from that, is a real effort to modernize our government. And that comes from public engagement and a constructive effort, not a blow-up effort. And so those things are things that I think are possible. And I'll wrap in healthcare reform in that issue as well, because I think, again, a lot of times, whatever status quo you have develops a pretty strong constituency, and they're very dug in because of loss aversion or whatever else you want to describe. When the chips get thrown up in the air, you do have an opportunity to actually try to move things that might have been immovable previously. And I think, unfortunately, we're in that space where there's so much damage, so much chaos, and it's going to likely get a lot worse, that there may be an opportunity to rebuild better.
And, historically, obviously, the New Deal, had a massive change in the operations of the government, with FDR. How is he able to go about re-engineering the whole government? And presumably, did he kind of do it in a completely constitutional way or not?
Well, I think these are all questions that are going to get litigated. The challenge, I think, is that the litigation system is slow and the damage is now. So it's not like you can put it all back together again, if and when the rulings are that what he's doing is illegal. One of the things that I think, again, you're taking me in a broader direction, which this one I'm more than happy to go in. There's been an interesting movement in our courts around thinking about the balance of power between the executive and the legislative branches. And you have a very strong power play by this president and this administration to make claims on very extensive powers of the executive. At the same time, you've had a court, Supreme Court, and amongst some of the supporters of this president, a movement towards trying to rebalance the power so that the legislative branch is actually, put into a stronger position. And just to be concrete about this, it's the whole argument around, the powers of the administrative state. And one of the arguments is that major questions should not be decided by unelected civil servants. And I think you have a very powerful question that's now on the table, which is the destruction and the turning upside down of the government that is taking place now by this administration and by Doge. And I think that relationship itself is problematic, the Musk-Doge administration relationship. Are they violating the major questions doctrine? Because they're doing things that are quite profound without Congress's initiation or blessing. And so I do think that there are going to be some big questions that will have to be resolved now. There are areas where the legal precedent is quite clear that the power belongs to Congress and not to the president unilaterally. And this administration appears to, buy into the attitude, just sue me. And I think this is a bit of a reflection of back again, I talked about the family business that Trump came from. That may have been what his process in the private sector is, just to do something and say, sue me if you disagree. I think that one of the things that is really important to understand is when you are serving as a public sector leader, you should not be operating like private sector folks do. And you have to understand the importance of restraint and that you don't utilize public power with the view that if you've overextended it, that the courts will correct you. You should be trying to be careful in and of itself. And I fear for the future here, because that, of the criminal investigative and prosecutorial power that this administration appears to be willing to use against perceived enemies, that is incredibly dangerous. And we should not be in a world where we have to wait for the courts to brush that back. That is not a good world to be in. That leaders in the executive branch should take a careful approach to the exertion of those kinds of powers, and be more respectful of the rule of law. And that's why you want career civil servants there too.
And you mentioned Musk. Actually, it took us a while to actually get to Musk, surprisingly.
Yeah.
But in terms of his role in Doge, obviously Doge is not a real department, although it has the name sort of in it. But is there a precedent for having someone like that come in and
No.
do this type of thing?
No, there's just no precedent to this. There's no, I mean, to begin with, he plainly has broad and deep personal financial interests in many of the things that he's engaged in. And the rules and norms of our government are designed to try to ensure that those that are wielding governmental power are doing so without a personal financial interest, because you want to make sure that those powers are being used for the public good and not for the personal interest. And the idea that anybody can make that choice for themselves as to whether or not their interests are involved, or they're making a choice on that basis, makes a mockery of the system. And so there's never been anything like it. It raises deep problems in what is being done, how it's being done, and again, there hopefully will be a reckoning around trying to make sure that our systems are put back together in a way to prevent that kind of thing from happening. And in the meanwhile, you need Congress and others to speak up that this is the way it should be done.
And so far we've been focusing on the federal government, but the state and local government is really quite large if you look at the number of people employed in that sector. So
Yes.
do you have any thoughts about that side of things, and how does that relate to the federal side?
Well, it's an important point. Much of what people experience in our country, the direct front line comes from local government more than anything else, and some state government. The federal government has some direct facing services, but they're again, 70% of the federal workforce is about national security. Again, most people don't understand that. 80% of the workforce is outside the DC area, so they're everywhere. But federal employees are in every community, but they're more focused on national security by far and away than anything else. So state and local governments are being impacted, and we're seeing this in pretty profound ways, where the shut down all grant making rippled through our country and the globe, and it still hasn't been fixed. So I think one of the more disturbing aspects of what is happening is that you have people who do not understand the implications, or seem to not care about the implications of their abrupt and pretty dramatic decisions. So that is worrisome. Again, when you're dealing with an organization as complex and as important as our federal government. So state and local governments are being impacted, and they're going to be on every issue that matters, from fires to air traffic safety to food safety to, again, cyber attacks. I mean, like, you name it, there's going to be relevance to cities and states. And when you look at the workforces, a lot of the state local workforce, come from things like teachers and very important, but they rely on the federal government in many ways. And that's important in terms of the specific services, but also the apparent willingness of this administration to use the leverage that they have from those services to try to push state and local choices that they may not want. So there's a lot at stake here. One of the more troubling, and there are many incidents that have occurred recently, or the Department of Justice's use of the prosecution of the mayor of New York City as a cudgel to make him be an ally on certain activities. And again, I'm not aware of any, certainly in any modern times, and certainly not such an explicit use of our federal criminal authority in that way. And to the credit of the career prosecutors, many of them resigned rather than do something that was unethical and wrong. So, but yes, so this has very large implications. There's no way to hide here. What's happening with our federal government impacts every American, every locality, every state, and frankly, the world.
And in terms of what could stop this, I mean, we talked about courts and the legal process, which could just take too long. So is the most likely way this could get stopped is if a faction of the Republicans kind of rise up in some ways to curtail Trump? I mean, how do you think, I mean, what are the ways this could all slow down or turn?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to know. I mean, I know this is going to be played later on, but as we sit here today, it's not yet been a full month. So it's quite remarkable to think about like how horrifying the destruction has been and as limited a time period as we're talking about right now. I think it has to be an all of the above strategy. And, I think it's extremely important that we support our civil servant. I do think that civil servants will be an important check on illegal and unconstitutional activity, and any help that they can be given along the way is a good thing. I think that the media plays a fundamental role here because at the end of the day, this stuff is happening. They just as soon do it with no transparency, none, zero, and no fact checking. So the media is vital in being able to shine a spotlight on what is actually happening. I think that there are critical stakeholders from veterans groups to church groups to businesses that all are getting hurt now and are going to get hurt a lot more. And so their speaking up will be important. Now, as a political process, yes, our system was designed as a separation of power system. The courts are supposed to enforce the laws. Congress makes the laws. The current administration is tromping all over the laws, and therefore one would hope that Congress would speak up about what is going on right now. That has not happened in any scale, and that is going to be important, going forward here. And that will happen if the public actually understands what's happening and speaks up itself, because that ultimately is going to be they're the ultimate arbiter. The power comes from them. So I think that is most fundamental. And I don't want to lose the fact, or the observation I made earlier, which is the hope is that it's not just stopping the stuff that is happening now. Let's actually move towards the changes that do make sense. Unfortunately, there's going to have to be a lot of rebuilding too, because we are, again, throwing away core assets of the American people in the destruction to the civil service that's taking place right now.
Well, it's kind of a somber sort of note, but I did want to round off with a couple of personal, non-government related questions.
Yeah.
One is, we do have some youngsters listening to the podcast, so many of them will be thinking about their sort of, first career after leaving university. They'll be graduating later in the year. I mean, what advice would you give them about careers in general, but also entering public service?
Yeah. So look, I mean, I have spent, I noted earlier, really my entire life in and around public service. And the truth is, I think most people are more motivated by purpose than anything else. Like, we want to live lives where we feel like we're making a difference. We're making the world a better place. And there really isn't any more fulfilling and powerful stage to do that than government. And, there are nonprofits. I'm working at one now. You can also do good work for the world in for-profits. I think there is a difference between organizations that are designed to achieve profitability or money as opposed to a purpose. That doesn't mean that, for-profits can't be net, benefits to our society. And we need a system in which, capitalism is actually a very great allocator of resources and of innovation. But what I would say to people today is look in your heart, find things that you're passionate about, pursue opportunities that enable you to fulfill that sense of purpose. You don't have to resolve your full lifespan, choices now. You really are only making choices for the next year or 2 years, so you don't have to put a lot of pressure on you. A lot of times people are told, do that later in your career, learn things, at a for-profit. I don't think that's correct. I actually think that you, especially in government, have the opportunity for real responsibility. I think you want three things to make a good job. And the first is that sense of purpose, something that actually speaks to who you are and your desire to make the world a better place. The second is you want to work with great people, because I think that's how we learn the most and have the most engagement. And third, you want to have real responsibility, because if you're in driving the car as opposed to the passenger seat, you learn a whole heck of a lot more. And learning, to me, is really the big driver in over the course of a lifetime. So government still provides that. Right now, it's a difficult position to be inside the federal government. There is state and local government. It will change. Our society needs an effective government, federal government. So don't give up on it, would be my advice.
And I love reading books, and I'm always looking for book recommendations. Are there some books that really influenced you over your career? Some books perhaps recently you've read that you'd recommend?
So on side, I'm a big Michael Lewis fan, and he wrote a book called The Fifth Risk, which really tells a story about the transition that should have happened that didn't when Trump came in. He's got a new book coming out called Who is Government that will be out in a month, and it's written by a bunch of different authors, like Dave Eggers and some great people telling stories about government. So can't help but promo those because they're deep in this. In terms of things that I find like most intellectually engaging, I'm a big Daniel Kahneman fan. So Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow is just a tour de force in terms of understanding, the built-in mistakes that we made and make and that I think is extremely powerful. There's a wonderful book called An Immense World, which I've read relatively recently, which looks at the ways in which our perceptions and different life forms' perceptions really shape how we think of reality, and in fact, even what the reality is. That's a pretty cool book, I think. There's a lot out there to read, and I think those are probably near term, my recommendation.
And that's great. Now, finally, what's the best way for people to learn about more of the work you're doing and about the Partnership for Public Service?
Fine, good question. As usual, it's our website, ourpublicservice.org. And, we are right now supporting civil servants and doing webinars to help them understand what their rights are and how to navigate in the world of today. We're also trying to share stories. So we've been involved in some of that Michael Lewis stuff that I just described. But it's really important for people to care, to learn, and to share stories about civil servants, because that is part of what the gap has been, is a public that has received services that they don't really understand where they're coming from, and it'd be better if they did, because they're about to lose a lot of them.
That's fantastic. Well, keep up the work that you're doing, and good luck for this period ahead.
Luck is always a good thing, and hopefully some of your viewers will say, "Hey, I want to put my oar in here too," because it matters.
Yeah, no, appreciate it. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Max.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thanks for listening to the episode. Please subscribe to the podcast show on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Leave a 5-star rating, a nice comment, and let other people know about the show. We'd be super grateful. Finally, sign up for our free newsletter at macrohive.com/free. That's macrohive.com/free. We'll be back soon, so tune in then.